trade-off that got made in a lot of school systems in the 1990s, where the courts are decreasingly interested in supporting desegregation efforts, and local advocates who know that have to make a strategic choice. Are they going to keep on fighting for statistical desegregation, or are they going to recognize that the political space for that is shrinking, and so they need to try to find another strategy? And Judge Dinkins was one of the people, he wasn't yet a judge, right, who was part of making that negotiated arrangement in Nashville in the late 1990s that ends the court-ordered desegregation in the city. And what he and other advocates thought they were securing was a greater investment in resources for the city schools, and especially a targeted investment in those schools that were knowingly going to be resegregated, right? So that they were schools that were going to be, Dinkins and others knew, probably resegregated both by race and by class. And so that deal set up some structures that still exist in Nashville today, right? Enhanced option schools. That language came out of that moment with a commitment to provide extra funding, to make class sizes much smaller, to make the school year longer, to make sure that those schools had extra resources. And although I haven't tracked it carefully, and certainly not in the last 5 years or so, what happened very quickly was that the political will to make those allocations just sort of faded. So you had a notion that you could sort of trade desegregation effort for resources, which has been a struggle that African-American leaders have had to think about for a long time, right? And it very quickly becomes clear that when you don't have the pressure of the courts, nor do you have the political will from the majority white city to allocate those resources. So that's just to sort of, I think you know that story, but that's what I think, that's one of them, I think a moment of, I think Judge Dinkins has a great abiding frustration at having watched that hard-won negotiation fade, and that commitment fade. So what can you do, right? So you've got schools within Metro that are more highly resourced than others, even if you don't pay any attention to how public resources are flowing, right? You only think about what resources come from families and communities that they're willing to donate into the PTO, right? You know, there do exist places where there is real resource allocation across schools, right? So that donations to parent-teacher organizations are taken as donations to the city system, let me put it that way, not to the city government, but to a consolidated sort of union of PTOs, right? And that there is a distribution of those funds. Because, you know, there are places in Nashville where PTOs have built wings of buildings and hired teachers and done things that, you know, truly sort of transform the landscape just with their own private dollars. New York City has refused to challenge those kinds of consolidations of dollars, and for probably the same reasons that leaders in Nashville would be reticent to do so, right? They fear that doing that would provide another incentive for people with resources to leave the system. So they're hesitant to challenge that. So you asked what the solution is. So one of the reasons I studied the past is that I don't tend to have a very good and informed sense of exactly how you should proceed going forward. But I do think that, you know, that this is a tricky conversation because there's both deep inequality in how resources are allocated inside the system, and MNPS is radically underfunded by any measure, right? The whole system. So, you know, I think there's a strategic choice to be made about whether the argument is for investment in the system overall, or investment, or trying to balance imbalances within the system. And, you know, organizer folks can know better what would play more effectively in the local landscape. But the long history, though, right, is that even when districts do get more money, they then tend to be allocated in inequitable ways. So it's definitely the case that advocates and teachers can be powerful voices on this. Advocates working in the most under-resourced schools need to keep on pushing for that, for greater resources, and can illustrate the consequences of that underfunding on the children and communities that they serve. I'm not really good at managing a chat and conversation. Claire, do I get to count on you for that?
I can, yes, absolutely. I was
Okay,
going to
great.
jump in and say, Chris made a comment. Chris, I don't know if you want to speak more to that or add anything.
Yeah, well, just, I mean, the idea of PTOs in general, like, so when you have, I feel like looking away from desegregation efforts might be counterintuitive in a sense, because if you have segregated schools, then you're obviously going to have inequitable PTOs. Um, and I think uh, to some extent, the whole, magnet program and charters may be a potential solution to that. I've seen it firsthand. The school I teach at now for the past 3 years has a very engaged PTO with a ton of resources. And that's coming from 9 years in Title I schools where the PTOs were, you could get physical hands in the building, but financial resources were slim and for understandable reasons. So it just, when we turn away from desegregation efforts, it seems like you're already going to be limiting your financial means for your PTOs. And so I think you need to look at larger systemic methods to try to find that equitable balance.
Yeah. I also just want to say something about how we think about resources. I think that, and this is not in any way a response to anybody's individual point. It's just that I think in general, there's this trouble, right? Which is that poor communities might be deprived of some kinds of resources, right? Cash on hand, ability to buy air conditioners for classrooms that don't have them. But one of the constant struggles in American education is the struggle to not then link that notion of lack of financial resources to a broader notion of lack of resources generally understood, right? Knowledge especially seems to be the one that tends to go missing, right? And so I just think that I'm always trying to be attentive to that. We have a system that is financially exploitative, right? And therefore yields communities that don't have the dollars that they should have. That doesn't mean that we have, none of the schools that serve predominantly low-income children are schools without expertise about their own needs and expertise about what works in their own families. And American education has been historically very poor at recognizing that. And some of that's because teachers and others are trained to think of themselves as experts in a particular set of ideas about knowledge. And those ideas might exclude others, right, from the contributions that they could make.
We have about 3 more minutes in this group. We'll get a little message in 2 minutes. That's our 1 minute warning, but we still have time for questions.
And Claire, we're actually going to stretch it because we started a little late. So we're going to do the 5 minute, we're going to switch at 1:21-ish. So we'll have a little more time.
Hey, an extra.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Amy.
I'm Mike. I wanted to speak to what Nita said earlier, and I love that from her conversation with Dr. Erickson, that the way that hit me was this strategy for healing yourself is by not hurting others, right? And so Nita talked about that, what she can learn from that book, though it's hurting her adult self now on behalf of her child who lived through all those things, right? Because we can't go back to do that, but Nita is currently an educator. And I just love that kind of concise, compact way of saying healing myself, right? Because all of us, right, have trauma from any number of things. And Nita in specific, as a young Black girl growing up in Nashville, has that specific trauma on top of, I'm sure, other ones as a result of living in our city. But for her to understand, and for her to teach me to understand that healing can happen from not hurting our current students. And I think that that's such a powerful strategy in thinking about, especially with our pre-work and talking about what can we do When Alicia talked about, hey, white folks we can read all the books we want, but how are we going to act on that? And I think that what's been powerful for me is in this conversation, both Christina and Nita both are saying as Black women, hey, our role here too is that we also can hurt as a result of this racism that was put upon us if we're not careful. And so then kind of making me kind of redouble that effort to understand that I have that, right? But now she's giving me that strategy, right? So ways to deal with that, just that hurt, is knowing that I can go to school and, I mean, the healing is I can go to school and not hurt. And so I really appreciate that, Nita. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, and Mike, what that touches upon for me is something that I'm not claiming expertise in at all, but a sense of nervousness that I have in this moment when a lot of educators, because of the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, are going to newly feel like they need to speak directly or engage for the first time possibly in the classroom about racism in the US, and doing so without care, not only sort of appropriate appreciation for the importance and reality of that history, but without enough care possibly for the potential to injure their students, to do harm in taking up this history without enough concern for how it feels for different children differently positioned to be confronted with these stories. I think it's wonderful to see this turn of attention, but I think it also makes me nervous about the question of who's really ready to do this work, and what are the supports that maybe educators can put in place amongst themselves to be sure that they're attentive to the emotional, not just sort of cognitive or political, but emotional impact of these histories seems to me really important. And I think it's one of the things that I think is really hopeful about a gathering like yours, where there's a space, not necessarily with people like me around, but a space to talk to each other about what your ideas are, about what you're imagining this conversation looking like, about what you might be afraid of doing wrong in trying to take up these questions in your own practice.
I just got a text. We have about 2.5 minutes, so we still have time for another question.
Amy, I see in the chat that you mentioned that you were connecting that comment that I just made to the comment I made in the video about needing for educators to understand this history in general. I don't know if you want to say more about that. I welcome that.
I was just thinking about, and then Caroline, looks like you have a question, right? Okay. That like teachers are we have so many things that we're like required to do, and it just shows how it might like misaligned some of those things are when, this is really, really important. And like you said, people jumping into these conversations without recognizing the history of them, and the novelty for a lot of white people shouldn't be the main focus of the conversation, because it isn't new. And that when we center our novelty around the information, it loses the point, and it can cause more harm in addition to it.
I'm just seeing the one minute warning. So this may be a question that's raised and handled by another of the panelists. But my question related to who is doing that emotional labor in the classroom during these discussions, and pedagogically, if there are recommendations for making sure that that work is not falling on the most racially illiterate of our students in our classrooms, and that they're the ones having to unpack that, or feeling an obligation to unpack that for other students, or just feeling the hurt of other students either not wanting to engage with it, or saying, oh, I didn't know about this, this is brand new information to me.
That's a great question. And what I would try to do is point you in places where I think those conversations are happening. So I think some of the tools that the Teaching Hard History Project through the Teaching Tolerance has might be helpful. There are other educators like Bettina Love, who wrote a book called Abolitionist Teaching. I think I might be getting the title wrong. It sort of really centers thinking about trauma. So I think that I would suggest.
Oh.
That.
Oh, it's PARNASSUS dot, I believe it's .net. I will double check it, but that links you to Parnassus Bookstore, which is an independent bookseller here in Nashville, that you can buy books and have them mailed to you, but you're buying through an independent local bookstore.
They also have a curbside pickup. I've done that a couple of times. You can reserve it and then they'll send you an email when it's ready and drop it off in your car.
Yeah.
Hi all. I can tell we're continuing to talk a lot from our past conversation. I'm Claire. I'm going to be facilitating with Dr. Erickson today and just making sure we're keeping the time. I know we kind of shifted our minutes back a little bit. We were right in the middle of wrapping up in our previous room, and it looks like y'all were too. So we're all just going to adjust. It's okay. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to have a casual question and answer session with Dr. Erickson. We're so excited that she can join us for this EDCO event today. She's an associate professor of history and education policy at Teachers College at Columbia University, New York. She's also the author of many different papers, but notably for Nashville, Making the Unequal Metropolis, School Desegregation and Its Limits, which many people in this group may have heard about or read. And hopefully you all were able to watch our video with her talk with our other speakers ahead of time. But we'll go ahead. I am going to record this session. Otherwise, feel free to drop whatever comments or questions in the chat, come off of mute. And if you want to, you can use the hashtag EDCOWorks to comment or tweet or put any thoughts of yours on Instagram. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll get started.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you.
Hi, I have not read your book because I'm new to Ed Co-op and, really wishing that I had joined in much earlier so I could have learned all of this by now. So I apologize if you've answered this question in your book. You know well that Nashville, after we, spent all that time going through busing and had a very desegregated school system, as soon as the busing order was over, we essentially resegregated very quickly. I teach in a school that's 85% African American, and I think most of our schools are pretty segregated. When you look at trying to make schools better, should we be looking to figure out ways to desegregate, or should we be putting that goal aside? And is it better to put that goal aside and focus on other ways to improve the education we're giving to our most vulnerable students, all of our students, but especially the most vulnerable ones?
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure it's answered squarely in the book, so I don't think you have to apologize. So I am not a social scientist, and I'm not a person who sort of uses the kinds of data that people can look nationally and say, here's the trend and here's the sort of quantitative answer to your question. But I do trust the people many of the people who do that work. And so I'm generally persuaded by scholarship like that by Rucker Johnson and the sort of cumulative reports that have come out of the Century Foundation in the last 10 years that are essentially saying there is an outcomes-based and quantitatively supported argument for the educational benefits of desegregation for children. And so to take up one answer to your question, if what you're concerned about is inequalities in educational outcomes measured by graduation rates, measured by test scores, measured by sort of broader measures of lifetime success, then desegregation is a useful intervention. And so that would argue not to say, well, we tried it, it didn't work, let's move on. With Nashville and the stories that I know about Nashville more specifically in mind, I think people in Nashville would understandably meet that broad assertion with some skepticism. They said, well, supposedly we did it here and we're in this not ideal position by any measure right now. So how do we square that? I mean, one way to think about that is that Nashville did statistically desegregate its schools at a level much higher than many systems from 1971 to 1998, with a very sharp decline after 98, like you know. But at no point in those years of desegregating its schools by busing was the system making a set of choices based on equality for all children in the process. And so what has really never been tried in this country is what youth activists in New York are now calling real integration. You know, attention to simultaneously the numerical desegregation of schools and the questions about the more qualitative experience of equality inside a school. So who's represented in the curriculum, who's present in leadership, and any number of other metrics that are really crucial and that tended to be quite either unattended to or poorly attended to in Nashville's previous experience of desegregation. So I think rather than thinking of something that was tried and failed, I think it's more effective to think of desegregation as something that's never been fully tried, if we mean a sort of more equitable approach to the process, not just to yielding what I call statistical desegregation.
Could I just ask you to repeat that? You said two things, the numerical desegregation and then the second part of that, if you don't mind.
I mean, I'm borrowing the terminology that youth activists in New York have been using right now, which is what they're calling real integration, right? Okay. And there's a youth organization called Integrate NYC that has a set of 5 principles for real integration. There's a lot that's useful in their work. They're at integratenyc.org, I think, and you can read up on their efforts there. I think they still actually don't say enough about curriculum. And I think that there's more that could be done there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a couple of points about that, or responses or questions about that. One, in reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, the How to Be an Anti-Racist, he pretty much takes on the integrationist idea at every level and challenges it. Pretty much throughout his argument. So I wonder, because he's talking about things at the policy level, and that the schools, once again, to use the schools as the tool to solve some of the larger social issues is sometimes where we get off the rails with desegregation, or as Kendi puts it, with even the integrationist idea, because he's separating the integrationist from the anti-racist idea. He makes a distinction between those, and that as you think about segregation and busing and all that, I'm from Boston originally, even though I teach in New York. So I grew up in the Louise Day Hicks, South Boston, bricks at the bus stuff, and so. It seems like that there's wider social ill that we need to deal with, and that asking the schools sometimes to be the tool here, or the cure, is beyond what a school can do, or even a school district. I wonder what you might say to that.
Thank you. So I want to take the last one first and then come back to the first point. I think one of my basic goals as a teacher, working with future teachers and future people who will work in education in the graduate school classes I teach, is to emphasize what some scholars have called educational utopianism, or others have called educationalization, this long-term American tendency to look to schools to solve social problems that are or I should put that differently, social or economic or political problems that are well beyond the scope of what a school as an institution is positioned to actually work on, right? That's been true for nearly as long as there's been a US discourse about education. And it is understandable that especially people in a school of education and people who work in education are inclined to think of ourselves and the institutions we work in as very powerful places. But the tendency, but that sort of professional confidence can then lead to more and more people outside of education saying, well, we can just expect schools to fix it. So we can think of Brown versus Board of Education as looking to schools to solve one piece of a Cold War era racial crisis. We can look at vocational education across the entire 20th century is supposedly said to resolve issues around poverty. Any number of other, any number of other ways in which schools have been turned to for these broader purposes that usually for which they are ill-suited. So I entirely agree with you that that's a pattern that we have to resist. And it's especially hard, I think, for people in education to try to resist it because we want to feel powerful and we want to feel like we can do things. But we actually need allies and we need a broader structural and economic critique, I think, to draw on in making arguments about how conditions for teachers in schools should be different and better. I read Kendi's argument to be a criticism especially of assimilationist logic. And assimilationist logic is, I think, a fair description of a lot of 1970s and 80s integrationist effort, right? But that's not necessarily the same as criticizing the idea that schools should be desegregated spaces or that we have a radically segregated system that itself in its segregation, not as a result of individual choices, but as the result of tremendous historic legacies that people know about and we can talk more about if you want, that segregation is a problem in that framework. It's just that when it's approached in assimilationist ways, inequalities are reconstructed. And I think in a lot of ways, that's an argument that I think is very much in line with my criticism of what happened in Nashville under the name of desegregation.
Thank you.
Thank you to those who have shared out so far. Again, feel free to come off mute to engage in conversation or drop any questions or ideas into the chat.
I'm also just looking at the bottom row of people who I either know from real life or Twitter, and it's nice to see you. So, hello. I mean, I guess I can turn the question back to you all collectively. Like, to what extent Harry, Beth actually asked the question this way, like, should we be thinking about desegregating schools or should we not? When you think about the Nashville landscape today, how do you think about that question?
I know for myself, I feel like I don't really know the answer. I know that when just when you said, what do you think about that question? I know in my own mind, I thought, it's such a good question, but I just need to think about how I'm going to teach my class in virtual school. And, there is that sense of, how do I give my students what they need from me as a teacher and also, continue to grapple with these questions So not sure where that takes us, but that's one response.
I think that's a real and important response. And this is a terrible time for, both an opportune moment and a necessary one, but also given the demands of the pandemic, it's an incredibly difficult time to be trying to imagine new things, given the ways that the things that we thought were regular have shifted and changed. I spent 10 hours last week in a how to teach your class online seminar, and therefore they made me have a credibility bookshelf, and so I hear you. At the same time, there are places where things are destabilized in a way that I think I I'm not optimistic, but I want to recognize that there are some reimaginings, to use a somewhat overused phrase right now, that might be possible just because the things that we thought we always knew about the relationship between kid and school site and curriculum and parent presence, all of that is up in the air. And maybe there's some way in which that is productive. So I'm just, so sympathy for the position that those of you, especially who are looking at teaching full-time online in not very many weeks, are facing. But hopefully something constructive can come of this moment as well.
For anyone who wanted a visual reminder of Dr. Erickson's question, I put it in the chat. Should we think about desegregating schools or should we not? How does this apply to the Nashville landscape? So we can keep on that, or if someone has a new question or new comment, we still have a few minutes.
I'm Kate Azell, and I'm not a teacher. I'm on the EDCO board and a huge supporter of all the work that you all do. But it's interesting, the question of should you be intentional about desegregation, because there's so much conversation about community schools and, you know, making schools in Nashville good in all parts of Nashville, and those two objectives are not in sync. If you're going to have neighborhood schools, community schools, they're going to be segregated based on the way the city works. So some of the work I do is around trying to have quality schools throughout the city, but it would not decrease segregation. So that's just, you know, we have to decide what a quality school is first.
Yeah, I think that's part of where my question came from, just about should we even think about desegregating, or should we be putting our energy, is it better to put our energies into improving all schools, you know, taking the schools we have segregated as they are and making them better? I guess really that was my question. And where is it most productive of equity and quality to put our energy?
And I think when you look at desegregation, and you're looking at just a school, and like I think Kate was saying, our neighborhoods are segregated and the schools are part of our neighborhoods and our communities. And when you decide that we're going to desegregate schools in isolation, someone is going to have to suffer. Someone is going to have to be pulled out of what's familiar. And growing up in Nashville, during this time, 1971, 1998, I was in metro schools, and I was bused out of my community into a different community. And so it was difficult for my parents to be a part of my school community, as well as where we lived. So if you look at desegregating schools in isolation, then you start to look at the idea of, are things equitable? Because there is a group that's gonna have to sacrifice something, as opposed to looking at desegregation, you know, as a whole, as far as, you know, desegregating everything, you know, communities and the like. So, so that is a good question, you know, should we just desegregate schools? And I just think that it's just such a bigger issue. School is just a part of that.
I don't mean to cut this wonderful conversation off, but Dr. Erickson and I are about to head out. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you for participating in this video. We really
sorry not to be able to say more.
I know we can't. I'm so sorry, but Garrett, thank you for sharing.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking out. And thank you to everyone who shared.
Thank you all for commenting and for your great questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, friends. How are you? Oh, Dr. Durnan, are you following me?
Kind of looks that way, doesn't it?
One.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi all. Thank you for being with EDCO today and here for our event. I hope everyone was able to watch our video with our panelists, our speakers ahead of time. With this section of our talk today, our Q&A session, we have Dr. Erickson with us. Dr. Erickson is an associate professor of history and education policy at Teachers College at Columbia University. She's written a lot of different works and a lot of research. Really relevant to Nashville, though, is that she's written a book that some of you may have already read or heard about, Making the Unequal Metropolis, School Desegregation and Its Limits. So at this time, I want to remind us quickly of just some norms. Keep in mind airtime. We'd love to hear from as many people as possible. We do only have about 20 minutes together, though. So to participate, I'm going to make sure my chat is open as a facilitator, but feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat. Come off of unmute. We do ask that you mute yourself if you're not speaking so we can hear everyone. This is recorded, so you will be able to, if you want to hear other sessions after, go back to it. And if you want to comment on this on Instagram, Twitter, social media, please use the hashtag EDCOWorks. And with that, we'll get started. Dr. Erickson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to see everybody.
Hey, I guess I'll jump in. How are you today? Ricky Gibbs, Nashville. When they were introducing you, we talked a little bit about your policy background. And one of the things that has been troubling to me with educational policy, not only when we talk about funding, but just how we're allocating certain things. So I want to put some numbers out. I just had a conversation on the school to prison pipeline, and I would love to hear your thoughts since you have done extensive research and policy when it surrounds education. We found through a study with ACLU that there's 1.7 million students across our country that are in schools with police but no school counselors. We found that 3 million students are in schools with police but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with police but no school psychologists. And over 10 million students are in schools with police but no social worker. So just thinking about educational policy and the work that you've seen across the country, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on why we see these type of numbers when we talk about schools being under-resourced, but we don't find money for counselors, psychologists, social workers, but there's always money to put police officers in schools.
Thank you for that question. I think you said what comes to mind, or maybe you didn't say that, but I was thinking what comes to mind. And the first thing that came to mind was, what are we doing, right? And then the second is, this long history in this country of criminalizing Black children. And that is, and I'm putting it this way, not to take in any way away from the sense of urgency about this problem as a present matter, but instead just to notice that there's really strong scholarship on this in the last decade, that it's very, very clear that even in times of austerity, when we say there's not money for any number of things, teacher raises, new buildings, et cetera, both at the local and at the federal level, this country has been willing to invest in policing, which tells you something about not only, tells you something about a lot of things, but I think at core, what it tells you is that a lot of these state institutions have been willing to engage chiefly with Black children as either as one colleague of mine puts it, as presumed to be criminal. So I think that the ways that teachers see the presence of policing in their schools, the ways that families experience policing in their schools, and the way that students do, have got to be more visible to people, and to understand that that's, and for people in education, of course, people who care deeply about their schools feeling safe and being safe, to recognize that a discourse about safety in schools isn't the same as a discourse about policing in schools, right? And that what the numbers show you is that the more interaction children have with police, the more likely they are to end up in the system. So having more police doesn't mean that you have a safer school. And in fact, a lot of the, well, I'm sure these are all things that you know as the principal of a school, but I think that, that is my sense of why. That is not the same as a sense of what kind of political movement would be needed to help challenge that. But I think that one of the things that this very difficult and tragic moment of national reckoning after George Floyd's death might open is the ability for people who are not who are not directly connected to policing, they thought, to begin to perceive and to decide to speak about the relationship between their work, for example, as teachers in a school, and this apparatus of policing and incarceration that is really a core and unusual, internationally an unusual American reality. So thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
Greg, it looks like you're talking and on mute.
I apologize. Thank you, Dr. Erickson. Dr. Gibbs, I'm wondering if your ears weren't ringing as Representative Buggs was in the other room discussing the work you're doing at Warner quite lovingly. So a nice little shout out from her in that space. Sorry to interrupt there, and thank you for the reminder, Dr. Erickson.
Appreciate that.
Again, to ask any questions or comment, feel free to just come off mute. We're trying to keep this a casual conversation, or drop anything in the chat. I know for some of us, our audio might not be working, but we can also use the chat feature.
I have a question. Hi. First, thank you for hosting this. It's really nice to be able to hear it from like an expert and connect this to the classroom. I would like to share a struggle that I have as a teacher. I've been teaching for 4 years in Manhattan. And our school tries, we are committed to teaching Title I students from the projects. And they also we are committed to teaching to be college preparatory, making sure that we meet the students where they're at, providing the support and services that they need, and then also getting them ready to succeed in college. And in many ways that we have done so, especially in the humanities, where we are a project-based school, the kids learn how to research and write like a stellar thesis paper, and it's incredible, and like ask critical questions. I do feel like we have a lot to do working in the STEM areas. And I think one thing I've been noticing is that, our school, we pride ourselves in being a small school that cares a lot about the social emotional well-being of the students, helping them affirm their identity. But then once we go to college, they leave this school that they've been extremely supported in, and then they go to a place where they're not. And I find that a lot of my previous students who thrived in high school end up dropping out of college. And I think losing a lot of faith in society or like what's out there, or losing faith in themselves. And I know that a lot of it is systemic. So I would love to hear your insight into this phenomena, and if there's any action that can be taken or message that we can send to the students, but I'm kind of at a loss at this, in this field.
Thank you for that question. I think, so I don't do a lot of work in college to sort of transitions from high school to college. So I'm just going to share the two questions that I would want to ask. One of them is, but both of them really are rooted in suggesting that you and your colleagues do some work to gather information from the young people that you've worked with and see what's happening for them. Because so one set of questions is about whether there are ways in which the curriculum is or isn't preparing students for the kinds of challenges they find in college. And that can be structural, right? Are students in super regimented school contexts that when they move into college and nobody's looking and nobody's sort of breaking things down into worksheets, they're not sure where to begin. Then if that's the difficulty that students are reporting, then it circles back to, you know, ways that one might think about gradually providing students more and more autonomy over the course of their high school years so that they're more ready for the autonomy that they'll meet in college. Another possibility is quite different. It's not looking into the school at all, but instead reckoning with whether what's happening for your students is just the result of this American reality, which is that college is incredibly expensive and difficult to secure. And I don't mean only for people going to elite institutions. I mean that, you know, we don't fund the cost that it takes to be a student. And so and the jobs available to students and the families that low-income students might be coming from, the jobs that might be available to them aren't jobs that pay people enough money to be able to sustain themselves while also being a student. And so what you might be seeing is the result of this system and its deep failures, right? As much as it might be, and that might be a challenge that motivates you to think about curriculum, for example, and what kids are learning in a different way. To what extent do, or to be thinking about political action around this problem in a different way, right? I think I'll just take this thin segue to say that I think like every school should have a unit about the minimum wage. Every high school, everywhere. What is it? What should it be? How do we decide? Like, you know, we have one that's entirely, in my view, entirely untenable for the support that individuals and families need. That's not something that children shouldn't be ready to question. And we have the opportunity in schools to do some math work and some civics work and some history work around those questions. I see a question from Crystal Churchwell Evans about how resegregation is a national problem, but what specifically, how can we understand, especially what Nashville did to create this environment? I think that when I think specifically about Nashville, right, there are many places that are deeply segregated in their school systems today. New York City is one of them, and I would not describe New York City as a resegregated system. You could describe pockets of it that way, but in general, I would describe it as a continuously segregated system. Nashville's different because for nearly 30 years, the city had actively statistically desegregated schools via busing and court order. So then how do you go from that, right, to currently regressing to the national mean, right, which is a very segregated national mean? I think that one of the things, and we talked about this in another breakout group, one of the things that Nashville did, and I'm not faulting anybody involved in this process because I think it probably felt like the only available option then, but a decision made in the late 1990s by both the city leadership and the plaintiffs in the school desegregation case to essentially try to trade desegregation for resources. And what happens in that process, you know, deciding that you're going to resegregate schools but you're going to promise more resources to schools that would be resegregated and have higher need in terms of economic segregation as well as racial segregation. What happens there is that promise of additional resources proves very short-lived, right? And so one of the things that we could say that Nashville did was, you know, sort of explicitly move away from the desegregation project and, you know, briefly think that they could replace that with resources, but the lack of political commitment to to equity, really, undermined that effort very, very quickly. And I think that's related to what specifically Nashville did to create this environment, which is that, you know, one of the harder continuities that I see in my work is that whether in the era of segregation or in the era of desegregation, Nashville's predominantly white leadership, decade after decade after decade, kept on focusing on serving best the needs of its white students and refused to identify itself as an organization that needed to be focused on the needs not only of all students, but more specifically, and as some of you have put, the most vulnerable or most disadvantaged students. And that refusal, you know, can play out one way in the 1970s when you refuse to equitably distribute the difficulties and challenges of desegregation, and you instead put them overwhelmingly on the Black communities. But it plays out, I think it's still a reality now, where you can imagine school system choices that are made by the desire to bring white middle-class students back to the system, which is often this sort of phantom notion, like if we can only get them back, then we will be better. It's a conversation that drove decision-making in the 90s. And that same conversation can drive decision-making now in ways that tend, again, to reproduce inequality more than to challenge it. So I think that is a national pattern, but I think Nashville is a particularly strong exemplar of it. I hope that helps with your question.
We have just a few more minutes before our Q&A portion of today is going to close out. So if anyone has comments or a final question, we do still have a little bit of time left.
Hi, I'm Eva from the Horace Mann School in New York City. And I'm wondering if you can comment as a historian on what to do about US history. There are so many stories that can be told, and there are so many stories that need to be told. It's any suggestions on how to approach moving more towards an anti-racist US history curriculum in schools?
I haven't thought of this question in exactly this way before. So you're going to get a very unformed answer. So one way to think about this is to think about it historically. What has driven the US history curriculum as we teach it? It's been driven by a sense that you have to start with the stories of a small body of very powerful people and their ideas and trace those ideas over time, right? If we sort of think about starting with the founding of the country and then moving through political history from that. I don't mean to characterize what you're doing, but lots of people would conceptualize the US history curriculum that way. I am fairly convinced that if you chose radically different starting points, you could get to many of the same themes, but in a more inclusive and genuinely representative, and therefore genuinely historically accurate, and therefore also hopefully more anti-racist way. So how can I think of an example? You learn a lot. I'll take George Washington since he's the easiest target, one of the many. We're comfortable with the idea that we should be teaching George Washington's story. You learn a tremendous amount about George Washington if you learn about Ona Judge, who's the enslaved woman that he pursued vigorously to re-enslave. And so you learn both about his commitment to slavery, and you learn about her insistence on her freedom. And you don't have to figure out the dynamic in which you tell George Washington's story first, and then you have to add on something else. So if you started with her, you get him too, but you've started from a place that sort of ensures against her exclusion. So that's what I'm thinking right now.
Thank you so much for that question. And I wish we had more time. We have literally like 35 seconds left in this room. But if there's any last thought, Dr. Erickson, that you have anything to close, we'd love to hear it. I know it may be a little late to tackle something brand new.
No, I just hope that maybe EDCO will put together a list of sort of resources and ideas that came up at different points in this conversation, because I feel like that's been really generative. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we'll look at the recordings after. Thank you all so much for being here. We will have the teacher work session at 2:30 if you'd like to.
We're going to wrap it up here. We have just a few seconds on the clock for our hour. We're actually just a little bit over. I think I'm lagging. I'm going to wait 30 seconds while we all arrive. I want to express sincere gratitude on behalf of all the teachers of the Educators Cooperative working together to make today possible. Thank Dr. Erickson, Representative Buggs, Mr. Vilson, and Alicia Ford for their time, leadership, vision, and generosity with us today. It was really something special, and it's the first step. We have to plant a lot of seeds in the summer to tend to all throughout the year on behalf of all of our students who need us to take these risks and are counting on us to do very difficult work and to make our classrooms safe and supportive for Black students, brown students. All students need us to be having these conversations and to feel uncomfortable in this manner. So thank you very much to all of you for your time today, for your questions, for your attention. We're going to take about a 30-minute break. The panel is concluded. We are finished, and I'm so grateful for your time. For teachers who are interested in joining a planning session to create next steps, to name accountability partners, and to share resources, please come back in 30 minutes on this channel. I'll be here, but in 30 minutes, we'll begin with Alicia Ford. Everybody who's here on the line, I will be sharing an email of gratitude, certainly, as well as recordings of the rooms in which you were just a part of and the other ones in which you weren't as you moved around, as well as links to a lot of the resources, how to get in touch with the resources, books, work, hashtags, all the things going on that we're going to need to continue this work. Mr. Vilson's Educolor work is unbelievable, and the resources he has compiled there, the next steps, the available things you can do, it's a great place to start. We have forums on the Educators Cooperative site as well, where we'll be sharing that information. Local plug for Equity Alliance. This is early voting season, and they are doing an incredible amount of work to ensure that votes are counted and people are registered all over town. So if you're here in Nashville, look, their schedule this weekend is chock full of opportunities to volunteer, to get involved, and to make sure that votes and voices are counted. Thank you all. That concludes our panel discussion. Our teaching planning session begins in about 24 minutes here on this channel. If you wish to just mute yourself and hang out, move a little bit, get some blood flowing, it's probably late for a cup of coffee, whatever you want, a soda or something to help yourself. Thank you for your time. I will follow up with all of you with links to the recordings, as well as how to stay connected and continue this work. Thank you, Dr. Erickson, Ms. Buggs, Mr. Vilson. So grateful for your time and attention and leadership. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.